Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our semi-plenary session. I am Claire Murphy. I'm a graduate student here, and it is my privilege to introduce our speakers for this session today. So our first speaker is Professor José Vidal, and Professor Vidal is a full professor of the Institute of Philosophy at the Universidad de los Andes in Chile. He's the Dean of the School of Philosophy and Humanities at that university. And his research interests include Aquinas' moral philosophy, contemporary ethical problems from the perspective of Aquinas' philosophical principles. And the title of his presentation today is Aquinas on the Indifferent Moral Object, a Small Problem of Consistency in His Moral Action Theory. So, Professor Vidal, take it away.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank you, the organizer, especially Chris over there. Chris is not here, but secondly, I must tell you that my English is not good, so I apologize for that. Please be patient. And thirdly, I have to say that my approach to St. Thomas is from the awareness that he's far, far more intelligent than I am. And therefore, if we think differently about the same thing, it is probably me who is wrong and who has not understood what he's trying to say. So I am really very open to being corrected on the possible mistake I might be making in interpreting the issue of St. Thomas' moral action theory. But I have to say, so far, I see the problem that I'm going to explain, as Aristotle said to Plato, amicus Thomas sed magis amicus verita. I must also say that I am convinced that the St. Thomas moral philosophy is like any other in history, a gorgeous and complete symphony. Within that philosophy, the theory of moral action is of incomparable richness and detail. This small inconsistency is exceptional and does not affect the perfection and beauty of the whole. The hypothesis of this exposition is the following. In the moral philosophy of Thomas Aquinas, the existence of an indifferent moral object would be inconsistent with the explanation of the morality of human action, because the latter, being voluntary, has its objects necessarily, even if implicitly, refer to the total end of human life, and therefore it would always be good or bad. Of course, the goodness or badness of certain objects could be less relevant in some actions than in others, as happens in the cases of examples given by St. Thomas himself, picking up a piece of straw or going out into the field. In both cases, there would be a good moral object, and the action would not take its moral quality only from the end and circumstances. My paper is divided into two parts. The first summarizes St. Thomas' thought on the causes of morality of action and shows why he holds that the moral objects can be indifferent, but the individual action cannot. In the second part, I developed the arguments why I think that from some principles of St. Thomas, one should conclude that the moral object is never indifferent. The second part, in turn, is divided into two sections. In the first, I explain why the object shouldn't be indifferent on the basis of the nature of voluntary action. In the second, I directly analyze certain properties of the moral object, which lead me to the same conclusion. I will read only the pars secundae of my paper, and even this one not completely. The reading I will do will refer to ideas contained in the part I will not read, but I think that knowing a little bit of St. Thomas moral action theory, you should not have any problem to understand what I'm going to say. I will try to show why the moral object in the context of Thomas moral action theory should always and necessarily be good or bad. I'm not going to read everything as I told you, but you told me I have a little more time. Okay, that's good. We already know that St. Thomas thinks that a particular action will always be good or bad because some of the circumstances that are present in the individual situation of the moral agent will necessarily have a certain proportion to the good of reason. We also know that this is true, at least in the case of the remote end of the action, which, as we have already noted, St. Thomas sometimes treats as a circumstance. Finally, we also know that there are circumstances other than the end, which, being a principal condition of the object, cause the good or evil of the action. The question is why, while the end and those circumstances that are principal condition of the objects necessarily enter into the order of reason, the object does not. If a circumstance causes the good or evil of an action, it can no longer be just a circumstance, but must be a principal condition of the object. Why the object does not cause the good or evil? St. Thomas teaches in many places that actions are always realized in the realm of individual things and never in the realm of universals by abstractions. No one wants things that are universal by abstraction. The dear friend must have a first name and a last name, and the dish of ravioli must look, smell, and taste good. Circumstances belong to moral action according to their individual natures. Place and time, the who or the how, influence the morality of an action according to its particular existence. It cannot be said, for example, that an action of speaking considered separately from its individual existence is good or bad because of certain tone of voice. Because an abstraction, it has no tone. The tone of voice exists as an accident of the individual action of speaking. The tone of voice can be a real circumstance of the action of speaking insofar as the action is individual. Only in this way the tone of the speech can influence the action. For example, by preventing the end of speaking from being achieved, as well as would have been possible if the words had been spoken in a more appropriate tone. Moreover, the moral nature of a circumstance can appear as such only in individual reality. An action is surrounded by many circumstances, but not all of them are moral circumstances. Practical reason recognizes which circumstances are morally relevant in order to include them in deliberation. For example, the more or less formal tone in which one speaks may be perfectly be irrelevant in a given situation. In that case, tone is not a moral circumstance, but also it may be the case that the tone is a circumstance that makes the action of speaking less good. For example, it is more informal that is appropriate for a given occasion. Although at the same time, this partial informality is tolerable. Finally, it can also happen that the same informal tone can be a principal part of the object and not a mere accident of the action. If a student intentionally uses it in a class presentation, immediately after the teacher has said that the tone should be formal. In this case, the very act of speaking becomes an act of disrespectful insolence. If an aspect of the action, circumstance, is only an accident or a principal part of the object, it is only shown in the individual context of the action. Therefore, the understanding of the moral object depends on the individual context of the action, similar to what happens with the circumstances. If the individual existence of the moral circumstance demands that it belongs for better or worse to the order of reason, without the possibility of being indifferent, would it not be the same for the objects? Perhaps St. Thomas thinks that the object can be indifferent because it is the element of the action that is most suitable for abstract consideration, since it is the determining cause of the genus or species of the action. And this is true. The species of an action can be present in many other individual actions, even if they are all different in their individual materialization. The species of theft is realized both in the Ponzi scheme scam and in the surreptitious theft of a candy in a supermarket, even though both actions are very different in their individual existence. However, the more general nature of the object does not detract from the fact that it is an object of a voluntary action that is realized in the realm of individual reality. The moral object gives its species to an individual action. However, this happens in a different way from the individuation of natural things. For natural things can have only one form, but since actions have a form determined by reason, it is always possible to proceed further and add something that changes the species. Finally, practical reason determines the object of an individual action. This object always has a proportion to the end, which is proper to the order of reason, because its nature or species necessarily makes it appropriate or not for achieving the human good that is at stake in the moral action. That is the very reason why the object is willed. We can look more deeply in the moral object of individual action. When St. Thomas explains that the perfect reason of our voluntary action is present in human acts and not in those of irrational animals, he says that, quote, there is a perfect cognition of the end when there is not only an apprehension of the thing that is the end, but also a cognition of the reason of the end and the proportion between what is ordered to the end itself. Therefore, the perfect reason of a voluntary action follows the perfect cognition of the end, since having apprehended the end, someone who deliberates about the end and about those things which are for the end, can move towards the end or not move at all, end of quote. The voluntariness of human action includes the consideration of the object or proximate end, which is ordered to the remote end, and finally to the ultimate end. Perfectly voluntary actions, which are realized in human actions, involve the awareness of the proportion between what is ordered to the end and the end itself. If there is some exterior thing or action that is proportionate to a good end, that is, leads to it, the object is good. If that thing or action is an obstacle to the attainment of the end, it is bad. Someone might say that the proportion or disproportion exists in some cases, but not in all cases, and that precisely those in which it does not exist are cases of indifferent objects. In a voluntary action, which follows deliberation about what leads to the end, the person assesses whether the object or proximate end actually leads to the end, remote end. Assuming assuming the moral good of the end, the remote end, if the object chosen does actually lead to it, it is morally good. And if it does not lead to it, it is morally bad. Could it be indifferent? No, because the cause of its being willed is precisely its capacity to lead to the end. If the object were indifferent, it would mean that it does not lead to the end, and so would simply not be an object of choice. It is necessary to keep in mind, moreover, that the capacity of an object to lead to the end, insofar as it is moral, arises from the fact that there is something in it by which it is proportionate to that end. It is not a proportion due to causes extrinsic to the thing, as happened in technical action, but due to intrinsic causes. There was a great debate between proportionalists and other philosophers, Thomist philosophers, at the end of the last century, that I think that proportionalists reduced the moral object to some technical object, but that is another story. The object is will because it has certain orders of reason which makes it capable of leading to a formally human good. Let us examine, for the sake of clarity, what happens with the examples St. Thomas gives of action indifferent by their object. The examples of Summa Theologiae are the following: picking up a blade of grass from the ground or taking a walk in the countryside. The object in the action of picking up a blade of grass is the blade of grass as a thing, and the action of picking it up as an exterior action. In taking a walk in the countryside, the object is the field itself and the action of walking in it as an external act. If we look at this object, it is easy to think that they are indifferent. A blade of grass, an action of picking it up, the field and the action of walking in it do not seem to designate anything that is morally good or bad. Even more, it seems that both can be good or bad. The problem is that, as St. Thomas himself points out, there are words that do not express the good or evil of something or of an action. Does that mean that they are not good or bad? I think not. Every human action can be considered in the genus naturae, separately from its reality in the genus moris. Examples given by St. Thomas are eating and having sexual intercourse. We could add picking up a blade of grass or walking in the field. It's obvious that every human action, including its object, considered in the genus naturae, is indifferent, but it is so because it has been abstracted from the order of reason proper to the genus moris. But human beings do not choose external things or actions only according to what they are in their genus naturae. No one chooses simply to pick up a blade of grass or walk in the field. One chooses to pick up a blade of grass in order to tidy up the floor of the house, in order to play with it between his lips, or in order to give a signal to a murderer that the circumstances for the crime are propitious. One person does not choose to walk in the countryside, but to walk clearing the mind in order to finish a presentation for a conference, or to walk as a way of resting from long time spent sitting in front of screen in order to finish a presentation for a conference. Or to walk as a healthy physical exercise in order to avoid leg pain. One does not choose to have a sexual intercourse, but to have it with one's own or another's spouse. one always chooses an object that has a human meaning according to the order of reason. In all these cases, the object is the thing and the exterior action, the blade of grass and the action of picking it up, the field and the action of walking in it. The problem with the objects is not that they are indifferent, although described as such, they may appear to be so. The problem is that the proper words do not exist to specify an object according to its place in the order of reason. It is quite common and perfectly understandable that this happens with insignificant moral objects. But that does not mean that they are not good or bad. The description of the object outside the order of reason is an abstraction that places the moral act in the genus naturae related to some natural power. But if we speak of human acts, they are not only in the genus naturae, but also in the genus moris, in which the object as a thing enters into moral consideration according to some human formality. The blade of grass as a speck on the floor, or as a thing fit to entertain someone by playing with it between his lips, or as a thing whose absence has the capacity to signify the existence of circumstances favorable to commit a crime. The exterior action is an object insofar as it deploys the capacity of the exterior thing. But what is being done in any of those cases is a good or evil human action. That good or evil is, in these cases, may be very insignificant, but this confirms the thesis. The objects are good or evil, even though they are insignificant. It could be said that the blade of grass being a speck on the floor is because it is in the wrong place, and that the action of picking it up refers to a circumstance which does not modify the object, which remains indifferent. But I think this is not the case, for in this case, the circumstance is no longer a circumstance as such, but a principal part of the object. The blade of grass being dry or fresh, longer or shorter, in such and such a place of the floor of the room may be circumstances, but its being a speck or its being a sign for committing a crime are not. It is similar to what happens with a person who is the object of a sexual act of another. Whether he or she is the husband or the wife is not a circumstance of the action, but is a principal part of the object. The same is true of going to the countryside. As has been said, one goes for a walk that helps to clear the mind, or as a rest after work, or as a healthy physical exercise. All of these objects are ordered to some remote end, but all of them are morally good by themselves and by no means indifferent. Some concluding reflections. We can speak of action different by their object when the object, by abstraction, is in the genus naturae. But if we speak of human action, there is always a good or bad moral species determined by the object, regardless of whether or not there is a word that designates it in a way in which the human good is explicit. To pick up a blade of grass, insofar as it is an act of tidying up, is good, while to do so as an action of cooperation with murder is bad. Note that in both cases, the action is not good or bad simply because of the remote end, since the thing is willed precisely because there is a formality in it by which it is placed in the order of reason that makes it proportionate to or not to that end, to that remote end. The objects of actions that follow the imagination rather than deliberation are also indifferent, such as stroking one's bird or swinging one's leg while reading. We might also think of someone mechanically picking up a blade of grass. In these cases, indifference arises from the fact that these are not moral actions. There may be a third sense according to which an object could be indifferent, but this is not pointed out by St. Thomas. Many different actions, according to their species, are capable of leading to the same end, and so it would be indifferent which one you choose. But in this case, the indifference is not of the objects themselves, but arises from the fact that there are no reason why comparatively consider one is preferable to another. Indifference, in this sense, assumes that according to their species, all alternatives are morally good in one case or bad in another. To relax on the weekend after exhausting day's work, someone could stay at home reading or go to watch a good movie or go out for dinner. It makes no difference which actions he or she chooses, but all alternatives are humanly good by their objects. If my central thesis is right and there is an inconsistency in it is very strange that St. Thomas would hold it. Why would he have held it? I think he came to hold it for historical reason. The conviction that some things are indifferent, adiaphora, the Greek word, has often appeared in history of thought. Very generally speaking, in the ancient world, the existence of states of the soul, of interior disposition, and of indifferent things was affirmed. In the medieval world, the emphasis was on the indifferent actions. And in the modern world, the indifference of beliefs and doctrines is upheld. I believe that many authors that St. Thomas considered authorities, who thought that there were indifferent things or actions, influenced him. Also, many authors of the 12th and 13th centuries, right preceding St. Thomas, who discussed Abelard's idea that the good or evil of the action comes from the intention, also influenced him. Many of them, although they denied the Abelardian thesis, affirmed the existence of some indifferent acts. Among the authorities is, of course, St. Augustine, although St. Thomas seems to misinterpret what he affirms. Among the authors of the 12th and 13th centuries, who may be said to go so far as to form a certain tradition affirming the existence of indifferent actions, are Peter Lombardo, William of Auxerre, Philippe the Chancellor, Alexander of Hales. Among the authors more or less contemporary to St. Thomas are Hugues de Saint-Cher, Odon Rigaud, and of course, Albert and Bonaventure. In all of them, St. Thomas read about the existence of indifferent actions. Considering this list of names, it is easier to understand why St. Thomas supported the thesis of the existence of indifferent acts, at least because of the object. This is a matter for further research, but in any case, the thesis that there are indifferent moral actions by their objects seems strange and inconsistent compared to other parts of St. Thomas' theory of human action. Thanks.
We have some time for questions, but for the sake of those tuning in from home, let's try to use the mic. So raise your hand and I'll bring it over to you.
Please speak slowly.
Yeah. Well, I have an accent similar to yours, so no. I think, Jose Luis, that the way you present your thesis is too rationalistic. In this sense, you consider actions that are not deliberate, but you say they are not moral actions. That's not true. Morality encompasses all voluntary actions, not only deliberate actions. And we do during the day, like the great majority of actions that we do during the day are not deliberate. They are voluntary but not deliberate. And then you can think of a saint, a criminal who converts, he becomes a saint, and he might do during the day exactly the same things that he did before, with a few exceptions, let's say. And so those things that are exactly the same are now saintly, and they used to be criminal, but not because of their object, but for other reason. I think that, like walking to his job, he does exactly the same before conversion, after conversion. Writing, I don't know. You know what I mean? There are a ton of actions that he might do exactly the same, and before they were the works of a criminal, now they are the works of a saint.
Yeah. First of all, I think that when we talk about the moral object, the proximate end, we are talking about what leads to the end, and usually you deliberate about the means or what leads to the end. First of all, but it is true what you are saying, that in some cases you just act, but sometimes deliberation is implicit. If you move to some house far from the university in which you work, first time you deliberate. I can walk, I can take a bus, I can go by car, and then it's the deliberation is have been already done, so you don't need to deliberate again. But about what leads to the end is the proper object of deliberation. No? In that sense, I said what I said. Mm-hmm.
Thank you for thank you for the talk. I would say every human action is a choice, and choice is the deliberate action, a deliberation of the reason, which is an act of the will. So deliberation has to be in any human action. I think that seems to be essential to it. The thing I would want to ask you about is, at the end, you talked about why would he talk about it in different actions. I think what you said is historically quite right and quite informative, but in my mind, he has to talk about it because in some sense, reason establishes the good. But, and that's in the moral action. You brought up very many times the difference between the genus of moral actions and the genus of natural actions. I think he's fighting against, from his Aristotle teaching, he's fighting against the implications of speculative thought deriving and driving moral thought. He's clearly trying to make a distinction between them. And what you call the order of reason, I think, is exactly what he's trying to do, because it's based upon, it ends in the practical, which is the particular, rather than ending in the universal. Does that make sense to you?
I'm not sure if I understand you.
I'm agreeing with you.
Yeah. I know. I don't agree with you in which in all of you have said, but for example, there are voluntary action that are not choices.
But the voluntary actions aren't the deliberate choice in itself. Every human action, in order to be a human action, has to originate in a choice.
Nope. I don't agree. If you have alternatives, of course, but sometimes you don't have alternatives. and there is no choice. But it's voluntary what you do.
Okay. I don't think that's, it really comes down to, well, then where's the order of reason established? Is there any order of reason in that act where you don't have a choice?
Sorry?
Is there any order of reason being established by the agent when you don't have a choice?
Yes, of course. For example, if I can go to some place just in a boat, I don't have any choice. But the object of my act is good according to the order of reason.
It's still a determination by your will, because you want the end. And if there's only one way to the end, you've made a choice in choosing the end to choose the means to the end if that's the only means necessary. Aristotle says very clearly, and Thomas agrees with it, that the origin of human action is in the act of choice. And that's book 6 of the Ethics. Its commentary makes it clear. I think every argument that he makes in the Prima Secundae is based upon that same thing. I'm not disagreeing with what you said. You don't have a choice because there's other alternatives. But to choose something because that's what's necessary in order to achieve the end that you have in mind, that's a choice, because you chose the end in that sense by the only means necessary to bring it about.
Okay, but I think that St. Thomas doesn't think that that is a choice. But anyway.
Yeah, we can continue.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your talk. I would say I completely agree with your overall thesis that there are no morally neutral actions, since any action is part of the human life, and human life has an end. And if your actions lead to the right end, the right kind of life, then you can assess that that action as part of leading to that. So completely fine with that. Also, with the last reference, historical reference you made, the Aphora tradition that comes from the Stoic philosophy, that's probably why the problem arises, the problem you are dealing with. But so this is my question here. It's about whether you have considered the specification of action or the individuation of action. So what counts as an act? Because maybe, like, touching your beard, it's indifferent and it's an act, but it's not still an act that has a moral value.
Yes,
so,
of course.
Or like, I mean, if we and that's my final remark. If when we have lunch today, we choose chicken instead of salmon, maybe there is no reason for that, and that's a choice. I mean, you choose,
Yes.
And that's indifferent. You could say, yeah, I mean, insofar as this is a way of being healthier now, or whatever, or not doing whatever farther end there is, then there is a moral relevance to that choice. But if there is none, and if you just consider the choosing of salmon over chicken, then you can say that that's really indifferent.
Yes.
So, and I'm saying this because if not, maybe we're over moralizing the realm of action. So not every decision we do has that moral.
No, but
that will be my question.
Yeah, it's not very important if you choose salmon but you can choose salmon or meat because to eat salmon or meat is good, morally good. So
you can do that for that, or you can do that for no reason. So why did they choose chicken or that? Yes, for no particular reason. Then that's indifferent.
Yeah, in that sense, yes, but they are not morally indifferent.
So in which sense then are they indifferent?
No, in their objects, and in that sense, they are not morally indifferent. Yes, comparatively, same. Eat salmon or whatever, but you can choose morally good things because those objects are morally good.
Thank you very much for your talk. I'm Lauren Reynoso from Yale. I guess I'm wondering, so at least since Anscombe, there's been a huge aspect of philosophy of action where the point is you can redescribe an action as multiple descriptions. I'm wondering if the same isn't true. Since Anscombe, philosophers of action have talked about how you can redescribe an action under a variety of descriptions. So I'm flipping the light switch, I'm moving my finger, flipping the light switch, turning the light on. I'm wondering if the same isn't true of objects. So under some descriptions, the object is not morally indifferent. You're right. You might be right about that, right? And picking the blade of grass, what I'm doing is I'm ruminating on a memory, or I'm plotting my enemy's demise, or whatever, or signaling to my compatriots to do some such a thing. But the other description, the object is morally indifferent. I'm picking a blade of grass to do such and such a thing, and not simply in doing such and such a thing. So I'm wondering how if the redescriptability salvages Thomas's ability to talk about objects under some description, while also preserving your point that under other descriptions, the object might not be morally indifferent.
Sorry, the final question was?
If the notion of redescription allows us to say that under one description, an object is morally indifferent, like Aquinas says, but on another description, there's always going to be a further description in which you're right, that under that description, it's not morally indifferent. So in which case, both you and Thomas really aren't disagreeing. You're talking about different levels of description.
But the problem with which you are saying is that we are talking about voluntary action, moral actions. Moral actions, qua-moral actions, I say that they have always moral object, good or bad. Of course, in another level, you can talk about in different moral objects, but you are abstracting the act precisely from the morality in the genus morals. The human act that is just picking up a blade of grass, I think doesn't exist. In that sense, if your act is a voluntary act, a moral act, always has a human meaning, and it's not just a physical thing. But I agree that there are levels in which you can speak about in different acts, but you are abstracting from the moral reality of the act.
All right, it's time for us to move on now, but the plan is to have a few minutes at the end of the session to open up the floor to questions for both speakers. So if you have any burning questions for Professor Vidal, hold on to them.
Yes, I'm very interested in what Professor Brock has to say.
All right, so our next speaker is Professor Tianyue. He is a full professor with tenure at the Institute of Foreign Philosophy at Peking University, and he serves as the vice director of its Center for Classical and Medieval Studies. His research interests lie in ancient and medieval philosophy with a particular focus on pre-modern theories of mind, emotion, morality, and free will. His work has been published in numerous distinguished international journals, There's a long list, including Recherche de théologie et philosophie médiévale, Augustiniana, Res Philosophica, Review of Metaphysics, Oxford Studies of Medieval Philosophy, and The Thomist. Please welcome Professor Wu.
Claire, thanks a lot for your kind introduction. I also want to thank the organizer of this conference bring me here, especially Tracy Corey. Okay, my paper is too long to be read, so I prepare a PowerPoint slide, but it's also quite long, so I hope I can finish it on time. And the title is Aquinas on the Indeterminacy of the Will. And my talk is divided into 5 sections, and one for introduction, another one for conclusion. I will explain the structure of my talk at the end of introduction. So I begin directly with the introduction part, and I will refer Aquinas' discussions on the indeterminacy of the will to the intellectualism, voluntarism debate. So we all know that in the high scholastic period, philosophers intensely debated the psychological mechanism behind free will. All of them agreed on the existence of free will in rational beings, but they disagreed on its source, intellect or will. So a very simplified description of their position is like this. For voluntarists, the will is primary. It can choose even against intellectual judgment. On the other hand, for intellectualists, the will follows a reason, but reason itself can have multiple judgments leading to freedom. So in my talk, I will use intellect and reason interchangeably. Now, if we think about Aquinas' position in the context of this debate, we will find first that Aquinas, like many 13th century thinkers, sees free decision, liberal arbitrum, as the psychological basis for moral responsibility. So we will mainly discuss about deliberated choice in my talk. And Aquinas argues that moral practices would be meaningless without free decision. And he also follows Peter Lombard to define free decision as a faculty of both reason and will. But how reason and will interplay in the process of making a free decision is highly debated. So it's not difficult to say that Aquinas' position is is not easy to categorize in the intellectualism, voluntarism debate. On the one hand, we see that Aquinas leans towards voluntarism, and he clearly states that free decision is primarily attributed to the will. And he also argues that the will's freedom stemmed from its indeterminacy. It's not fixed on any specific end, act of willing, or moral character. So this threefold indeterminacy will be my main topic. And here I just want to mention that this emphasis on indeterminacy of the will suggests a voluntarist leading in Aquinas' thought. On the other hand, we also see that Aquinas stresses that the will is passive, moved by what the intellect sees as good. And he even relates the will's choice or indeterminacy to that of the intellect. So the will's ability to choose comes from the intellect's ability to present different goods. I think this hints at an intellectualist influence. The intellect is taken as the ultimate source of freedom. So now we see scholars debate whether Aquinas is an intellectualist or a voluntarist. Intellectualists argue that they will necessarily follow the intellect's judgment. Though some scholars mention the possibility of a determinist interpretation of Aquinas, but I think most of intellectualist reading of Aquinas accept a libertarian conception of the will in Aquinas. So they believe that even though they will necessarily follow the intellect's judgment, but the intellectual judgment itself is indeterminate and guaranteeing the indeterminacy and the freedom of the will. On the other hand, voluntarists argue that intellectual indeterminacy alone isn't enough for free will. The will must have a further capacity to determine its own inclination. And the first thing I want to say in this debate is that the indeterminacy of the will itself is neglected in this debate. There might be some textual reason for this oversight, because Aquinas explicitly uses the phrase Indeterminatio voluntatis only once in his early work on truth, question 22, article 6. But there are also theoretical reasons for this neglect, because we already say that for intellectualists, indeterminacy of the will is just a phenomenon that can be reduced to the intellect's indeterminacy. On the other hand, the voluntarists' needs a more active role for the will, going beyond just being indeterminate. Then why should we study the indeterminacy of the will in focus in this essay? The textual reason is that even though Aquinas rarely uses the exact phrase Indeterminatio voluntatis, he consistently talks about the will being indeterminate, even in his later works. And I think there are also more important theoretical reasons for examining indeterminacy of the will in depth, because studying this concept can help us understand how our agent overcomes indeterminacy to make a definite decision. So I think scholars focus more on the self-determination of the will rather than neglect the starting point of this process of determination. And I think our reconsideration will also highlight the will's unique contribution, which goes beyond the intellectualism, voluntarism debate. So this essay will first overview Aquinas' philosophy of action, focusing on cognition and appetite, and then analyze his account of the will's indeterminacy in On Truth. Then explore how the will moves from indeterminacy to determinacy. It concludes by showing Aquinas' view is intellectualist, but acknowledges the will's role, especially the significance of the will's natural inclinations. So I move to the second part of my talk. It's just some basics of Aquinas' philosophy of action. I think most of the audience know the debate about the development of Aquinas' philosophy of action. I'm not going to the debate here. I just want to mention that his view on the will's indeterminacy remains consistent. And we know Aquinas mainly analyze human actions in terms of faculty psychology. First, I had to admit that for Aquinas, strictly speaking, it is not a faculty of the soul that acts, but the agent, the whole individual itself that acts. But on the other hand, I think Aquinas insists that agent acts based on distinct faculties of their combinations. So unlike later scholastics like William of Ockham, Aquinas realizes real distinction between the soul and its faculties. And for him, faculty of the soul are distinguished by their acts and objects. And for my talk, I think two distinctions are crucial. First is distinction between sensual and intellectual faculty. So one relies on bodily organs and the other immaterial. And sensual faculties are concerned with particular objects, while the intellectual concerned with universal objects. Another distinction about cognitive and appetitive faculties. So if I can use a contemporary term, they have different directions of feet. And for cognitive faculties, grasp the world, it has direction from the mind to the world to because it aims at the truth. So the truth needs to be adequate to the external world. On the other hand, appetitive faculties aiming for the good, and it adapts the world to the mind's desires. Okay, so we see how faculties work together. If we combine the two distinctions above, we get four faculties: sensual cognition, sensual appetite, intellectual cognition, intellectual appetite, or the will. And Aquinas thinks that he has, I think he has a dynamic conception of action. So each action is a result of the interplay between appetitive faculties and cognitive faculties. For him, appetite motivates action, but cognition is necessary for appetite. And he even introduced a controversial principle of cognitive control of appetite. Yeah, Aquinas claims that appetitive capacity, including the will, is naturally passive, moved by what is apprehended. He still maintains this position in De Malo as well. And so here we see that a typical human action consists of 3 steps, and in which free decision or choice is the root of freedom. So here I will not talk about simple voluntary action without deliberation. So we say that external voluntary human action is normally composed of 3 stages. First is regarding the end, and the second regarding means, and the third, the execution of one's choice by our body. But I think the most important thing for my talk is that at each stage, there is an interplay of intellect and will, and the intellect is always prior to the will. So we say that the intellect apprehends the goodness of our end, then the will intends towards the apprehended end. And if intellect goes further to deliberate about the means or things for the end, then the will consent or choose among what is determined by deliberation. And finally, there is execution. But I think medieval scholars focused on internal choices because wrong choices in the mind are already morally culpable. So I will just focus on internal choice in later discussion. Now, with this background, I move to Aquinas' Indeterminacy of the Will in On Truth, question 22, article 6. And this is Aquinas' main discussion of the will in determinacy. And I think it's also important before we go to the specific article, we need to know something about the background, which will prove crucial to our understanding of the will. And he distinguished three types of appetite. So there is natural appetite in all things, sensual appetite in animals, and the rational appetite in the will, especially in humans. And after classifying different sorts of appetites, he goes to ask how they will desire an object. So first, he discussed the natural or necessary inclination of the will. He claims that the will is also a kind of nature, quida natura. So like other natural things, the will has natural inclination towards its end, happiness. And this is taken as necessity. When the intellect identifies something as happiness, the will necessarily desires it. I think this aligns with the principle of cognitive control we mentioned above. All humans will what they perceive to be happiness through rational cognition. And yeah, it is against this background Aquinas introduced the threefold indeterminacy of the will. He asks further, besides happiness, does the will necessarily will everything else it wills? His answer is no, due to the will's threefold indeterminacy regarding its object, regarding its act, regarding good and evil. So we will examine them one by one. So first, about the indeterminacy of the will's object. Aquinas believes that the will is indeterminate regarding the means to achieve happiness, not happiness itself, or sometimes he would say that not regarding the end itself. If both salmon and the chicken are equal means to my end, so the will be determinate about which choice, both of them. So but I think here Aquinas mentions that different people have different suitable paths. So unlike non-rational beings, which have fixed ways to achieve their ends. But in this context, we don't know what role does intellectual cognition play in choosing the paths. Aquinas does not mention that at all in this context, I mean. So let alone the answer. We move to the second indeterminacy of the will's act. The will is also indeterminate regarding its act. It can will or not will concerning any object. So for any actual act of willing, the will has the capacity not to will it. So this sounds like a voluntaristic conception of the will, that the will has the absolute power or absolute control over the exercises of its act. But I think the explanation Aquinas offers in this context does not support such a voluntaristic reading, because Aquinas links this indeterminacy to the animal's capacity for self-movement. However, the self-movement of the irrational animal does not imply that the animal's sensual appetite alone determines its spontaneous acts. For even for the irrational animals, they have the sensual appetites themselves, are grounded in the animal's sensual cognition. So it's possible that the self-movement originates from sensual cognition rather than sensual appetite alone. So in the case of human action, we can also make a similar claim as well. Now we move to the last indeterminacy about the moral quality of the will. The will's indeterminacy is also seeing its ability to desire good or evil. So we already have a lot of discussion about this in Professor Widow's talk. And here, Aquinas thinks that this indeterminacy comes from indeterminacy regarding the means, but more importantly, it originates from the indeterminacy of our apprehension. So we can be mistaken about what is good. So here we see very traditional intellectual conception of evil. So moral evil originates or rise from our wrong cognition, from ignorance or mistaken moral cognition. So for Aquinas, moral error stems from reason taking something as referable to the end when it's actually not. And in the summary of this developed discussion on the indeterminacy, Aquinas explicitly links freedom and indeterminacy. So freedom of the will can also be seen in three ways. But here, I think the indeterminacy of the will is only taken as a prerequisite for freedom, but it's not sufficient for a full account of the freedom of the will. I think we need to go beyond indeterminacy for the following reasons. Aquinas also links will's freedom to its control over actions. So indeterminacy as a negative concept alone can't fully explain this control. So I think voluntarist reading are right, at least in this regard. We need a more positive account of freedom to explain the transition from indeterminacy to determinacy, because human actions are always concerned about particular ends under certain circumstances. And it's always definite or determinate. And now we need to know more about the control of the will in this transition from indeterminacy to determinacy. Aquinas argues that the freedom or the control lies in self-causation. We already saw it earlier in the discussion in On Truth. And Aquinas believes that only self-movers are free. But in some other contexts, like Summa contra Gentiles, it goes further to argue that all self-movers acquire the inclination to act through judgment. And he thinks that the difference in self-movement between humans and animals lies also in judgment, different manners of judgment. Animals judge by natural instinct, while humans judge through rational comparison, which is open to opposing possibilities. And so now we see the importance of intellectual cognition in the form of judgment in Aquinas' account of the will's control over its actions. So we need to revisit the origins of indeterminacy of the will we mentioned above. And first, I need to mention that all the participants of the debate agree that all acts of the will are preceded by cognition, but they disagree with each other what role of cognition plays in the determination of will. So I will argue that the indeterminacy of the will originates from the indeterminacy of intellectual cognition, particular judgment. However, I don't agree with intellectualist interpretation that the will's indeterminacy is fully reducible to that of the intellect, because I believe that the will possesses a degree of autonomy in shaping its inclination and actions. But this autonomy does not mean that the will is absolute power as voluntarists believe. So now we go back to the indeterminacy of the will. It's about regarding object and act. Aquinas argues that the will's indeterminacy regarding its object originates from the indeterminacy of rational judgment. The will naturally tends toward multiple goods apprehended by reason. However, reason cannot fully grasp the universal general good and its relation to particulars. So in this sense, the intellect itself is indeterminate in choosing means. This indeterminacy in judgment translates to indeterminacy in the will's object. So in this passage, Aquinas summarized the intellectual the role of intellectual judgment as the cause of freedom. I call it the will is the root of freedom in the sense that it is subject of freedom. But reason is the root of freedom in the sense that it is the cause of freedom. For the will can be freely drawn towards various objects, precisely because the reason can have various conceptions of the good. Hence, philosophers define the free decision as being a free judgment arising from reason, implying that reason is the root of freedom. So this is also from Aquinas' later work. But here we see, we go back, move on to the indeterminacy of the will's act of willing. Here, Aquinas still maintains intellectual position that links practical judgment to the act of willing. He definitely denies clear-eyed acrasia. By clear-eyed acrasia or weakness of the will, I mean one knowingly acts against her clear, present, and actually considered best judgment. This is impossible for Aquinas. For Aquinas, acrasia occurs only when the will chooses based on general dispositions or habits, not a present judgment of the best. So in his analysis of acrasia, I can go into detail here. Aquinas argues the will's choice is indeterminate because its preceding actually considered intellectual judgment is indeterminate. Okay, so we can also re-examine the indeterminacy from another point of view. The indeterminacy shows that the will exists in a state of potentiality towards various possibility. And so it needs to be actualized. And Aquinas distinguished between two ways faculty of the will of the soul is actualized: by specifying the object of the act or by exercising the act itself. Yeah, it leads us to the famous distinction between specification and exercise in the Malo question 6. And the intellect specifies the object of the will itself is the efficient cause of its act. This distinction tempts some commentators to introduce a voluntarist interpretation. But I think the distinction does not fully undermine the intellectual view. I want to mention the doctrine of this essential rational motivation of choice by Scott McDonald. He says that the will by its very nature makes a choice for a specific reason. So we can ask, does the will exercise its act for a reason or not? If not, how can it be called a rational appetite? If yes, then we can appeal to the rational of reason, the rational of this exercises to argue for intellectualist interpretation. So, but I think the intellectualist account needs to meet other problem, at least three here. The problem of infinite regress and the problem of Buridan's S. And the last one is not mentioned in Aquinas' text, but I think it's important to think about it here. I call it the problem of Occam's razor. For infinite regress, we have if understanding arises from a prior act of the will, and the will itself is contingent upon understanding the good. Doesn't this necessitate an even earlier act of the will for such understanding to exist, leading to an infinite regress? Aquinas thinks that there is no such infinite regress. It must stop at somewhere, and he invokes natural desires of both the intellect as well to show why it should stop. Because the intellect naturally desires to know, and the will naturally desire to actualize rational cognitive faculties, because the will is defined as rational appetite. I think this explains why the will exercises itself without needing another act of will or another act of intellect to initiate it. So the natural inclination of the will initiates the process of intending and making a choice. Then I move to Buridan's as problem. If the indeterminacy of the will can be fully reduced to intellectual indeterminacy of intellectual cognition, if our intellect presents two options as equally suitable and desirable as in a given occasion, then the will be paralyzed. So just like the so-called Buridan's ass will starve between two equal piles of hay. And Aquinas offers a solution which sounds like an ad hoc solution. He claims that the will can choose even in seemingly equal situations because reason can always find some differentiating factor. But I think there is a deeper reason for Aquinas' solution, because for him, only an object that is considered good from all conceivable perspective is determinate. But in human life, we can never find such object. So the last one is by Occam's razor. Probably I have to skip this. Yeah, for the interest of time, I go directly to the conclusion. So first, I want to emphasize again the significance of nature in Aquinas' understanding of the will. So also in On Truth, Aquinas says, I quote, however, nature and the will are ordered in such a way that the will itself is a certain nature. For everything that exists within things is said to be a certain nature. And thus, one should find in the will not only what pertains to the will, but also what pertains to nature. However, it belongs to every created nature that it be ordered to goodness by God, desiring it naturally. Thus, there is within the will a natural desire for the good that is appropriate for it. And beyond this, it pertains to it from its own determination to desire something not out of necessity, which belongs to it inasmuch as it is a will. So for Aquinas, the will is always a natural faculty, not a free faculty, as Duns Scotus argues. Aquinas rejects the notion that the human will operates outside the natural order. He posits that the will, primarily a faculty of the soul, while possessing a certain indeterminacy absent in other natural entities, remain bound by fundamental natural laws. First, it naturally inclines towards the general concept of good and cannot desire what is intrinsically evil. Second, as a rational faculty, it has a purpose or end for its actions. Like all beings, humans possess a unique natural end. However, this end is presented in such an indeterminate manner that it may not always be consciously apprehended or even considered at all. Consequently, the will is connected in an indeterminate way to the intellect's own indeterminate grasp of the ultimate end. This twofold indeterminacy is central to Aquinas' understanding of free will. Importantly, it does not imply that the will's natural desires are devoid of content or merely formal. The will is part of both the rational soul and human nature. So the good person wills encompasses not only the will's own desires, but also the natural ends of other faculties and the well-being of the whole person. This includes pursuits such as knowledge of truth, survival, and overall human flourishing. So I think the will's natural desires are broader than and encompass those of the intellect alone. It implies that the determination of the will natural desire cannot be fully reduced to the natural inclination of the intellect. So in essence, I think Aquinas' theory of free will is both intellectualistic and indeterministic. It is intellectualistic in the sense that once a deliberate judgment is formed in free decision, the will cannot contradict it. Otherwise, the will is contradicting a prior act of willing that initiates the process of deliberation. Yet, it is all indeterministic because practical judgments themselves are inherently open to different possibilities. Moreover, the will's freedom is not solely reducible to the intellect, as the will plays an independent role in shaping the very process of intellectual cognition. Ultimately, this theory is naturalistic in that the independence of the will is grounded in its inherent inclination to seek the fulfillment of the rational being. Thanks a lot for your patience.
Thank you. This was extremely helpful, and I thought the emphasis on indeterminacy is very important. So thank you for bringing that out. So I have two questions actually. So one of them concerns the thing you said right at the very end, that it's important that the will's openness to the good includes the good of all of the other powers of the human being.
Yeah.
And so I was wondering, would it be, am I getting your point correctly that the will's indeterminacy can be rendered determinate? So the will can sort of determine itself to some act, not just based on the actions of the, or the judgment of intellect, but also based on the, let's say the sense appetites. And that's related to my second question, which is, so you talked about akrasia as a case in which the will seems to set aside the judgment of intellect in favor of dispositions or habits that it's following instead. But I was wondering if that's contrary to this idea that there's of the essential rational motivation of choice, because there it seems like maybe the motivation sounds like it's the dispositions or habits. So the two questions go together. On the one side, should we challenge the essential rational motivation of choice with the thought that maybe these dispositions can also play some kind of a role in motivation? And if that's the case, then that would fit nicely with your concluding statement. I'm wondering how these things fit together.
Okay. Thanks a lot for your questions. Very challenging. And I will try my best. The first one is is concerned about the determination of the will. I don't think that the will can make a determinate decision or choice without preceding intellectual cognition. I only say that the will has an inclination to use other faculties of the soul to reach determinate choice. But what this choice substantially is needs to be presented by cognition, especially intellectual cognition. I emphasize the natural inclination of the will because you need to because for the intellect to think about what is good in these certain circumstances, the intellect as a faculty is also something in potentiality. It needs to be actualized and it needs to be exercised by the will. And these exercises of the will, I mean, using other faculties of the soul, is not preceded by further prior intellectual cognition. So that's for the first question. For the second question, I think I mentioned that for Aquinas, akrasia can only go against judgment in habit, or not a practical judgment that is actually considered. But I don't think this will threaten the rationality even of acrobatic person, because acrobatic person he says that he can have a different practical syllogism which presents something as pleasant rather than as something as good. So his acrobatic choice is still rational in that it follows a wrong or a bad practical syllogism. Yeah, so not necessarily just a result of habit. Yeah, okay, thank you.
Thank you for your talk. When you say that the will moves the intellect, do you also admit the requirement that the intellect must apprehend its own act in order for the will to move it?
Oh, okay. Very interesting point. I think first I agree that the intellect has a reflexive capacity, as some authors argue, like I think Scott McDonald says that it has such a self-reflective character that can comprehend its own goodness. But I think that in the case of initiating act of intellect, yeah, it's how should I put it? Because in some texts, Aquinas says the will also needs to has intellectual cognition that to understand this is a particular good at such an occasion. But in some cases, like Buridan's as, or like the capacity of the will not to think about happiness, he thinks that the will can actualize any faculty of the soul without preceding cognition. Yeah, without the intellect's apprehension of itself as something good. So yeah.
Can you point to a text where that interpretation of the will and its relationship to the intellect is made clear?
Yeah, I mentioned in my text, but not in slides. I think in his Summa Theologiae, Prima Secunda question, I think it's a question 10 and
Article 2.
I was thinking on a Spanish mystical, the John of the Cross. He says, because I don't know how to say that in English. Well, por ser de amor el lance, le di la casa al cáncer. Because I was moved by love, I got my prey, like I haunted my prey or something like that. And he is a Thomistic author. So I think he shows that not only there is a natural inclination of the will that I think is what explains the first intellectual grasp when we are very small, because we need to know what we are grasping previously, and we don't know it. We just love it naturally. That's how it is in us when we are very small, I think. But beyond that, you can cultivate that love, natural love of the will for God and that is like the tool with which you open the path to understand more and more, let's say, right? It goes before the intellect. I think that's clear it's what moves you to know, right? That's the...
Yeah, I think I agree with you, but I also think that the role of this natural inclination of the will to move intellect to know is limited. So it's only something that can initiate the process. But when the intellect presents something as actually good, then the will follow the intellectual cognition rather than anything that it's taken as natural or habitual or So
All right, for the last 10 minutes or so, I think the way this session works is we'll open up the floor to questions for either or both of our speakers. So yeah, Professor Vidal, please join us. Any questions for both speakers? Oh, yeah, both or either. Both or either. Yeah, go for it.
All right, thank you. This is for Professor Widow. Thank you very much for your paper. It was very clear, and it raises an interesting problem. And I think it's true that Thomas could be a little bit clearer about how he understands the indifferent object. I think that's true. But I have two thoughts. One is you spoke about the proportion of the act and the object to the end, right? And if it's good, it has to be proportioned to the end. If the act is good, right? It seems to me that, correct me if I'm wrong, proportion is a little bit ambiguous here. It could either mean something that reason ordering to the end encourages or advocates, or say giving alms to the poor, or it could be something that reason simply permits, poses no obstacle to the end. Right? That's one thing. I think picking up a piece of straw maybe is just, there's no obstacle to the true last end, according to reason. Now to the last end. Now that by itself probably wouldn't answer your objection, I think, because I think what you want to say basically is that the willing of the act of picking up a piece of straw is never indifferent, cannot be indifferent, right? Because you often, when several times you said the object here is the grass or the straw and the picking it up, right? Those are the object of the choice. And you said that's the moral object, right? And this is often the use of the expression now moral object is the object of the choice or the object of the will, right? Which indeed is the primary moral object, because that's the primary moral act is the act of choice or the act of the will, right? But at this point, I think we have to see something in Thomas's text, which is when he says that the act is good by its object, its end, and its circumstances, right? He has to be referring only to the exterior act, right? Because he says in the very next question, he says that the interior act of the will is good only by its object, good or bad only by its object, exclusive. And I think he would also say that the interior act of the will is always either good or bad. It's never indifferent because it always includes the end. Okay? In any object, when you choose something, you choose it in view of the end, and the end is either good or bad. Right? So the interior act of the will is never indifferent. That's also true. Okay? But for Thomas, there's two kinds of morals act. There's the interior act and the exterior act, and the exterior act has its own object. And I think for him that can be called a moral object too. So in the case, and the exterior act can be considered good either by being the effect of the interior act or simply according to its own object. Right? So I think the question would be, even if we look at the willing of picking up a piece of straw, let's say it's good because of the end, right? But it's not good by reason of being a picking up of a piece of straw, right? Because the piece of straw doesn't make the pick. There's no virtue that calls for picking up a piece of straw. Maybe I could put it that way. That's all. So it's a distinction in the expression moral object basis.
Well, basically, I agree, but except the last part of you, because to pick up a piece of straw, it is a good and human thing if the straw is something that in my living room and it doesn't fit in there. If I, yeah, but it's the main part of the object.
Suppose I'm walking along the street, I see a piece of straw, and I just get an urge to pick it up. I'm conscious of the urge, I consent to the urge, and I pick it up. And I'm aware that is no obstacle to my last end, and I have the right last end. But it's not in any way conducive to my last end either.
Yeah, I think that we should think if someone does that, why are you picking up a piece of straw?
I felt like it.
Sorry?
Because I felt like it.
But you're talking about a moral action?
I felt like it. I felt like it. I was aware that I felt like it, and I consented to the feeling, and I went ahead with it. That's a moral action. I do that sort of thing all the time.
Could be. I'm not sure, but that could be. I'll think about it.
Thank you. So this question is also for Professor Vito. So I was wondering if one possible way of resolving the tension in Aquinas' texts about whether or not neutral acts are possible is that maybe he's just describing, and I thought actually that your paper was going to go in this direction to resolve the tension. It seemed to me you laid out all the equipment for us to resolve the tension, but then at the end you said there was still a tension, so maybe I'm missing something. But I thought what your paper gives us the resources to say was that we could consider the act itself at multiple levels of abstraction. And there's a level of abstraction at which the act is not going to be sufficiently morally specified to be able to say whether it's good or bad. And it's at that level that the act would be considered as neutral. And so since we sometimes describe acts at that level and then add the specifying characteristic, we might think that there's an action type that's neutral and that needs to be further specified. But really what we're doing is we're just looking at action types at an overly general level of specification. So by analogy, we have this similar problem in the specification of animals, for instance, on the Porphyrian tree, where someone might say, well, there's no such thing as an animal. There's dogs and cats and horses and humans, but there's no such thing as just an animal. And then someone else might come along and say, no, of course there's animals. Look I'm defining one right now. Man is a rational animal, so obviously there are animals. But that's an obvious kind of, confusion caused by focusing, sort of extracting this overly abstract notion at the level of the genus and trying to make it be a thing in its own right. Well, it's just a kind that's insufficiently specified, and so we're still remaining at the level of the genus. And so I was wondering if that's just the way that that kind of solution can help us make sense of why Aquinas would identify certain action types as just being neutral.
Yes, maybe. Yeah, but the problem is that moral actions are always in the individual reality. In that sense, if you consider the action without those formalities that it has in the individual reality, there is an abstraction, right? And sometimes the abstraction it's from the moral traits of the action, and in that case, of course, you can get to some point in which the action is indifferent, or I don't know if that is the point. Yeah, in that sense, I agree. But you are abstracting from the moral traits of the action in that case. I'm not sure if I.
So why couldn't we appeal to exactly that solution to explain why it seems like Aquinas is saying that some actions are neutral? I thought that toward the end of your paper you were saying that there was this tension. Yeah.
Yes, no, I could add explicitly that. No, I don't have any problem with that.
Last word, Father
Thank you.
Brock.
Oh, sorry, did somebody else?
I think you were the
Okay. Can I? Maybe I can address it. I don't think you can. That's the way you can go for Thomas, because what he says in the text, he's talking explicitly about the order of reason, and not that you can abstract from the order of reason and look only at the genus of nature. Right? He's saying that some acts by their object are neither suitable to the order of reason, which I take it to mean encouraged by reason, or contrary to it. They don't care. They don't matter from reason's point of view. But it's still from reason's point of view, right? So you're seeing it, and he doesn't talk about seeing it in a kind of a general way. He's talking about the object of a particular act, I would say. Okay. No, on a voluntary act. On a voluntary act. On an external act, exterior act, but a voluntary exterior act. That's a moral act.
Right, but if it's just something that. Sorry. But if it's just an act that's. So I take it there's a way in which we could consider an act of nature as a voluntarily chosen act. And that would be a way of putting the act of nature into the order of reason, and a way of considering it within the order of reason. The moment we consider it as a voluntary act, now it's considered according to the order of reason. But still, if the description is so minimal that it remains a description in terms of the order of nature, then I think at that level, we do have something that's genuinely morally neutral, or could be morally neutral, and needs to be further specified in order to determine whether or not choosing it in this particular context would be good or evil.
Well, sounds like there's a lot more to talk about, but we are out of time. So let's thank both of our speakers one more time.
Thank you very much.